Welcome back to A Different Atheist Reads, A History of God by Karen Armstrong. I'm Christy, and let's get going with Chapter 3. Well, guys, it's been a while. It's good to be back. Hello, welcome back from the break. I hope you guys enjoyed some of the other content that I put up during the break. It was a lot of fun, and I actually have one more GOD or OBGYN episode. I want to do a fourth in the trilogy, in the spirit of Douglas Adams. But before I get going on the book, I should also quickly mention in the description box below I will put a link to a show, the Reason show that I was on last week talking about women and atheism. So you can go ahead, if you can't get enough of me during the week, you can check out that little segment. And a big thank you for the invitation to the hosts of the show and for having me on. It was a lot of fun. So check that out, get them some views, put up some likes if you like the discussion, and I hope you get something out of that. What I've done for this week is to read all of Chapter 3, and the way that I'm going to be handling this is I'm going to kind of give you an idea what it's like to deal with Karen. So together we're going to review what Karen covers in Chapter 3, and then I'm going to explain how I go about trying to figure out what is real and what is just Karen talking crap in her chapters, and try to figure out what the larger messages, and then try to figure out how to explain it to you guys. So if you want to see what my process is like, what resulted in whatever 6 videos or something for Chapter 2, then we can do it right now. The chapter is called A Light to the Gentiles. And Karen starts it by just jumping in, as she does. She doesn't explain why it's called A Light to the Gentiles. She doesn't explain what she's going to be covering in the chapter. She just starts talking and keeps talking and just goes for, pages and pages. And this is what she does, right? So the chapter again is entitled A Light to the Gentiles. She covers the life and death of Jesus in the first 2 paragraphs. So she's already finished with Jesus as an historical, like the historical figure of Jesus within the first page. Then she starts talking about Mark's gospel, and on about page 100 she starts to talk about the Jewish character of Jesus's mission, and claims the following on page 101. After his death, his followers decided that Jesus had been divine. This did not happen immediately. As we shall see, the doctrine that Jesus had been God in human form was not finalized until the 4th century. The development of Christian beliefs in the Incarnation was a gradual, complex process. Jesus himself certainly never claimed to be God. I actually agree with all of that. I kind of just wish that she wouldn't have stuck it on page 101. I wish she would have put it as the opening of this chapter, because as you'll see, the sort of evolution and changes to the Christology, or the ideas of what Jesus was and his messianic nature and what that entailed, does change over time. But she does at least kind of throw in here this notion. She doesn't connect it to anything or explain how it deals with the chapter, but at least she's being accurate. Unfortunately, Karen then muddles what the Gospels have to say by not treating them as individual pieces of information. She uses them to sort of get a larger theme, which I would disagree with. She mentions here on page 102. Again and again, Jesus promised his disciples that if they had faith, they would enjoy these powers too. By faith, of course, he did not mean adopting the correct theology, but cultivating an inner attitude of surrender and openness to God. If his disciples laid themselves open to God without reserve, they would be able to do everything he could do. And that's page 102. Karen, unfortunately, because of her blinkered worldview, does not acknowledge the multiple notions of Jesus that exist within the text. Some of you might be familiar with Bart Ehrman. He obviously has one view of Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher. Reza Aslan has another view of Jesus, and all of these forms of Jesus can be built up from the text. So Karen does not, in my opinion, do a good job here in explaining the nuances and the differences between the Gospels and the Jesuses they present. She then shifts into talking about Paul and his apostleship, and mentions that Paul had a very different idea of what the religion was from the apostles who knew Jesus in his lifetime, another thing that I agree with. And she writes, Paul, he was convinced that non-Jews could become members of the new Israel even though they did not observe the full law of Moses. This offended the original group of disciples, who wanted to remain a more exclusively Jewish sect, and they broke with Paul after a very passionate dispute. Again, I agree with all of this. Breaking, I don't know if there's evidence that they broke completely, but she's just basically here going through the theology as it moves over time, but not telling us where it's going. After talking about Paul, Karen then just turns and goes into Buddhism and Hinduism. Don't know why. She does this in other chapters too, not really connecting it to anything, not explaining why it's in a history of God. But on her typical hobby horse, she does again throw out this quote we've seen from her a few times since we're here. I just thought I'd mention it. Quote, "The texts, Buddhist texts, emphasize that these ideas were not to be interpreted literally. They had nothing to do with ordinary logic or events in this world, but were merely symbols of a more elusive truth." When it comes to Buddhism, that's just wrong. But we're not going to deal with that because it has nothing to do with the history of God. So try not to get caught into, Karen's web here of crazy ideas. Eventually in her chapter, Karen gets to the break between Judaism and Christianity. And around page 110, she starts making a lot of unsubstantiated and unreferenced claims about Rome. She writes, quote, "Nobody expected religion to be a challenge or to provide an answer to the meaning of life. People turn to philosophy for that kind of enlightenment." That's on page 112. She then goes on to say on the next page, 113, "Educated pagans looked to philosophy, not religion, for enlightenment." So wait. 112. Nobody expected religion to be a challenge or to provide provide answers to the meaning of life. People turned to philosophy. Or was it educated pagans? Again, Karen says both things, and they both contradict each other, which is more reason to not believe anything she says. Karen then goes into talking about Platonism and its influence as one of the more popular Greek philosophies, and then she just goes through a bunch of Christian thinkers, just wanders through this list, never really connecting them. She discusses Justin of Caesarea, or Justin Martyr. She talks about Gnosticism. She talks about Marcion and his Bible or his canon. She talks about Tertullian. She goes to talk on about Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons, and Origen, the early Christian thinker and Platonist, and she talks about a guy named Platonius, whom I've never heard of. She then mentions in the chapter the differences between the East and the West Church, and writes, quote, "As such, it, being Christianity, had become a force for stability and appealed to the Emperor Constantine, who became a Christian himself after the battle of at some kind of bridge in 312 and legalized Christianity in the following year." She writes this on page 129. And that's the end of her chapter. So what do we do with this? Well, let me tell you what I do with it. Step one is identify the bullshit that Karen is trying to sneak into the chapter. She's again guilty of more assertions about what people thought or believed without any kind of evidence, any reference, citing any substantiation for her claims. She incorporates Buddhist and Hindu ideas in order to make her God ideas seem more complicated and deep and humane and compassionate and about enlightenment rather than obedience than I think is warranted. She has a meandering narrative with no clearly laid out purpose or intellectual destination across the chapter. She then cherry picks various individuals, again highlighting things that help substantiate her narrative, not trying to consistently answer an external question by referencing it across the chapter. And really, God as a concept disappears entirely from this chapter. Except to distinguish the nature of God from the nature of Jesus, this history of God is just sort of already lost by chapter 3. So given now that we can start to see the arc of the chapter and see what Karen is doing and how she's manipulating it, what is the next step? What I would like to do to try to address this meandering, wandering, pointless chapter of Karen's is to structure it around a notion of the increasingly complicated and diverse theology that started to emerge out of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd and part of the 3rd centuries CE. So I'll do that by starting, as Karen does, with the idea of an historic Jesus. And I personally tend to fall on the side that there is enough evidence for us to conclude that a human male who is probably called Yeshua was born in the Galilee in the first century of the Common Era. He gathered Jewish followers, he preached to Jewish believers, and he was executed by the Romans for sedition or treason, and died and was left on the cross, and like other common criminals. I think that's perfectly reasonable, just as I do with, I think, the Buddha being an historic person, or other normal human beings to whom later legends are attached. And I do plan on doing a series on why I fall on the side of concluding the evidence supports a historic Jesus in another series after this one. So it's a topic I want to get into more. But for the purposes of this video, I want to do a little bit setting up the earliest theological developments we have, and how primitive they are, and how they progressively get more complicated. So I'm hoping that I can definitely, within the first video, cover the progressive Christology of the Gospels, and from Paul, comparing Paul with the earliest forms of Christian praise and prayer that we have evidence for in the text, and see how it really does change over the centuries. And then I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to handle the later theological development. I might point to other series and other things that you can go and look those up. But because Karen here kind of, again, drops the ball on the whole idea of God, it's going to be difficult for me to take the attributes of God that we've set up in the first couple chapters and show any progression, because God sort of disappears from this chapter, other than to be contrasted against Jesus. So again, sloppy thinking on Karen's part, but perhaps what we can do is use those concepts as an anchor so that when we come back, we can start comparing the God that Jesus is to the God of the Old Testament or the Jewish writings. Who knows? I'm kind of making this up as I go. And that is it for today. I'm going to try that one more time because it was fun. So that is us done, first video back, and we have a lot to look forward to in the next video. So thank you for showing up and coming back to the series. It's good to see you again. It's good to be back. I've been Christy. You've been awesome, and I'll see you next Thursday for a different Atheist Reads. Bye.